Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning or a good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Naweed Jabakal, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's webinar called ESG Transformation, Seizing the Opportunity, hosted by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with Refinitiv and LSEG Business. Before we begin the discussion, it gives me great pleasure to present to you the Al-Attiyah Foundation's latest academic contribution called Guidebook on ESG. I'm sure you'll all agree that this publication has come at a very opportune time, coinciding with today's debate and the growing importance of environmental, social, and governance standards, or ESG, in some of the world's most important companies. With Guidebook on ESG, the Al-Attiyah Foundation seeks to help policymakers, investors, companies, and stakeholders understand and navigate the intricacies of the ESG landscape. The book, Guidebook on ESG, examines the key drivers shaping the growing momentum on ESG, including things like increasing pressure from stakeholders, business profitability and competitiveness, the demand from institutional investors and consumers, and the quest to build good corporate reputation, as well as relationship with customers and government regulations as well. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the member organizations that provided the case studies featured in the book. Your contributions have added another dimension to this publication and further underlines the impact of ESG on important institutions operating in the Middle East. Good news, an electronic version of Guidebook on ESG will be emailed to all Foundation members and attendees of today's webinar in due course. Please also pay attention to updates on the Al-Attiyah Foundation's website and social media pages for news on when the publication will be available for download online. I have had a read through it myself, and it's very, very useful, particularly for the ESG space in the Middle East. So give it a read if you can. Now, before we move on to today's webinar, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping rules for the discussion. First of all, any technical issues during the webinar, you can click on the help button and the team will try and resolve any issues. For any questions for me or the speakers, you can click on the Q&A, and please note, in the interest of time, we may be unable to address all of the questions with the speakers, but I certainly will try to get them in. During the session, we'll be taking active polls, and you'll be able to participate in the polling questions, so please keep an eye out for that. And the recording of this session will be available using the same event link. Now, moving on to today's discussion, environmental, social, and governance standards have become the hallmark of socially responsible investors. Gone are the days when investors look solely at the potential profitability an investment decision. Today, as we all know, many investors and financial institutions consider it essential to align their portfolios with wider ESG performance, believing that companies that perform well on ESG are better positioned for the long term and better prepared for risk and uncertainty as well, especially important in today's environment. While ESG was temporarily deprioritized in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, activity is set to increase as the world recovers from COVID. An Edelman Trust Barometer survey carried out in September 2020 found that 88% of institutional investors around the world are using ESG performance indicators in making their investment decisions. Indeed, the COVID-19 crisis and the economic uncertainty brought about by the more recent war in Ukraine present an opportunity for businesses to focus on their ESG performance. However, adopting ESG principles comes with its own set of challenges, from identifying the best reporting framework to use to the lack of standards for measuring results or impact. These issues have slowed down progress, there's no doubt about that. For example, while the UN Principles for Responsible Investment signatory list includes 431 private equity firms from all around the world, only 16 of them, 16 out of 431, disclose ESG's impact on financial returns, and only half use ESG principles in monitoring more than 90% of their portfolio companies, according to Institutional Investor. Well, we've got a great panel for you to discuss all of this. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers for this session. First of all, a face that perhaps many of you will know, Ali Al-Shabibi, Partner, Governance and Risk, Business and Transformation and ESG at KPMG Qatar. We also have Ivano Ianelli, the Board Director of the ESG Foundation and someone who's been looking at this for many, many years in the Middle East. Delighted to also be welcoming Howard Bevan, Director of Energy at the Al-Attiyah Foundation, and Leo Chi Tong, Head of Sustainability at QNB. First things first, I'd like to now invite Ali Al-Shabibi for a short presentation. Ali.
Thank you, Naveed. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I echo your comments earlier, thanking the organizers for having this event. What I thought to do now is really to give a very short presentation, maybe set the scene for the rest of the webinar, really looking at a recent global survey, a CEO survey that KPMG has conducted. And what we've done is, in a few short slides, taken the comments that the CEOs have made around ESG, the topics of ESG. So essentially, when discussing the topic of the environment and climate risk, what was interesting is to see how many CEOs believe that climate change poses a risk. And that's really, when you look at all industries, 12% of CEOs thought this, but it goes up to 37% when you're really looking at CEOs in the energy sector. When asked, what is the most, if you rank all the risks in terms of prioritization over the next 3 years, environmental and climate change risk topped the list in terms of what risks they see. And interestingly, with risk, is that you have two types of risk that organizations look at. Type 1 risk is the risk that happens regularly, and you have your systems ready to tackle this risk. The type 2 risk, which really have become more evident in recent years, are the risks associated with one-off events that cause a shift that will not revert to the original. Things like the pandemic is one such risk. It created a lot of changes in business that you're unlikely to see a return. The phrase "return to normal" probably doesn't mean much in this context. So we see environmental and climate change risk is a type 2 risk when looking at your risk profiles. The next area that was discussed was really around the social aspect of ESG and what the CEOs have thought about that. And really, it's a key theme that came out of this is the need to tell the world your story, how to report your ESG performance, and how to be transparent in terms of reporting. I think some question marks still exist around the how to report, i.e., do you have integrated ESG reporting? Still, I think there is a lot of uncertainty around which direction the reporting will go. But I think there is a general direction that more reporting will be required, and it's very important aspect of their considerations. Interesting output of the survey is a lot of the CEOs are not looking at ESG as a compliance issue to tackle, but more as an opportunity. And really, it's an opportunity to adopt new technology and modernization and innovation into your business. In the sense that if you look at if you set yourself an objective of reducing your emissions as a business, the solution to that is likely to drive lower costs in your business. And that can come from really rethinking your business model, or rethinking the way you deliver your services. And that drives innovation. Now you could argue that this is not new, and it is not new. And I think that maybe the term ESG is new to some of us, but actually the concepts underneath it are not new, and they're effectively common sense, dealing with risks that you see on the horizon. Now, just to conclude, I think when you look at where are the opportunities for business, I categorize them into sort of three buckets, if you like. Bucket one is around deciding what's your strategy towards ESG. What do you want to do as an organization? How will you engage your stakeholders? How do you link it, which is very important, to your own business strategy? It really needs to be an integral part of your strategy. And how do you use innovation in your business really to drive that ESG agenda forward? And I think this word innovation is really a critical factor as in terms of whether you succeed or not in having a successful result or successful outcome. The second part, which I think maybe a lot of people are thinking about today, is reporting your ESG journey and reporting outcomes of your ESG journey. And I think that's an ongoing activity that you really need to tell your stakeholders and the different people interested in your business. What are your goals, and how are you doing against those goals? You need to be balanced and in your story, and it really needs to be long term. This is something that will take time for you to implement, and as a result, the reporting is really more longer term. And I think that's where you have the contrast with your financial reporting, which is typically year after year, yearly reporting, sometimes even quarterly reporting. So there's definitely a tension between those two aspects. And the final one is how to build trust in what you are doing to the wider community. So tackling greenwashing and avoiding greenwashing. Also delivering on promises. So I think one key thing that we see a lot is in the early stages of adopting and deciding to report, you tend to overpromise, and then you realize that the execution is not as easy as you have thought. So you really need to be very thoughtful in deciding what your journey is, and then tell the world that, and make sure you develop that trust by really ticking all the boxes in terms of achieving all the things that you've done. Again, avoiding greenwashing is a critical part. I think I'd like to just maybe leave it at that. I'm sure this doesn't give all the answers that people want, but at least it might create some kind of a basis for a further discussion. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much, Ali. That was really insightful and touching on some key points that I think we're going to be discussing as well, particularly around reporting and then perhaps greenwashing and ensuring reliability, which I've seen we've got some questions coming in already. So thank you for those of you sending them. I will try and get through to all of them. And I'll give a shout out to those people who have put those questions, just so that you know that they're being answered. Before we move to the discussion, I just want to move to our first poll question then. If you can, hopefully you'll get this pop up on your screen, and just give us your answers, please. So first question, in your opinion, what will continue to drive greater private sector commitment to ESG moving forward? what's going to drive greater private sector commitment to ESG moving forward? Do you think A, pressure from stakeholders and activists, which we've seen plenty of media attention on in the past few years? Will it be B, business profitability and competitiveness, the financial case? Will it be C, demand from institutional investors and consumers, more wide-term thinking? Or will it be government regulations that drive more private sector commitment to ESG? Or do you think it's going to be all of the above? Maybe if you think one of those answers is going to play a more stronger role, then perhaps choose that one just in the interest of finding out what people think. So if you can click on your options, please, and we'll get to the answers in a second before we jump into the panel discussion. I'll just have a look and see where we are with that. So early results coming in then. Oh, very interesting. 3/4. It looks like that's going to be hard to beat. So 3/4 of people here in the webinar think that all of the above. That's very interesting because they are all important points. 10%, 1 in 10 of you think that demand from institutional investors and consumers is going to drive forward ESG in private sector in the Middle East. And then about 7% say business profitability, the financial case, important, we'll touch on that. And then just a few percent thinking pressure from stakeholders and activists, which is interesting. And about 7% for government regulation as well. Okay, so we've got what you guys think before the webinar gets going. Let's start then with the first question. I'm going to come to you, Ivano. What's the business case for ESG? What benefits can ESG integration bring to a company's stakeholders? And that's a question that Rajesh Doshi has also touched upon, saying ESG reporting is essential. Why?
Thank you very much. It's actually an interesting poll result. I'm a believer that private sector can actually lead. So the proverbial carrot vis-a-vis the government regulation, which is the stick. I was really hoping business profitability would have taken the lead, but that's a long shot. For me, ESG is to be seen as the ability for a company to sustain its business model in the long run in an ever-changing environment. So you look at the pandemic, you look at climate legislation coming through. These are very difficult changes for entities to embrace. So the business case should clearly define the ability of a company, of an entity, to be able to adapt to an ever-changing environment. Now, when we look at diversity, if I have a board of directors of clones, how can the decision incorporate different perspectives? And this is where diversity, governance plays a role. And again, we look at ESG and we have the tendency of focusing on the E, giving them a carbon emission man, it's fine with me, but also the S and the G have a very relevant consideration in the way the business respond to an ever-changing environment.
Thank you. And just to put that question to you, Ali, as well, obviously ESG becoming far more important in the industry, but what's the business case for it as far as you're concerned? You speak to lots of companies in the region who are thinking about this. What can business leaders do immediately to try and tackle and take on the potential of ESG?
Yeah, so really the first inclination is to go and think it's a compliance matter, but when you start to look at the issue, is that you set yourself a goal, an ESG goal, and you start to think as a business, how do I achieve that goal? And so you know, if you were a company that does manufacturing and uses a lot of power in your factory, you have emissions as a result of that. Improving your ESG and you say performance will involve perhaps setting yourself a goal and reducing how much energy you use in your production process. That has a dual outcome. One is reducing your operating cost, but at the same time, it improves your outcome for the environmental aspect of ESG. So really, I look at it as an opportunity to rethink how you do your business. And you can use this example across different ways. If you're an airline or if you're a logistics business, or there's a lot of ways by adopting ESG, and it's not just the environmental, but also the other aspects, can result in innovative way of looking at your model, changing the type of fuel that you use, for example, treating your staff in a different way, or various things that you can do that can result in better business performance. Recently I was reading on Nike. Nike, what they used to have is a lot of waste when they produce their sneakers. And as a result of their ESG targets of reducing waste, they were able, through investing in a new technology, be able to produce sneakers by rather than using fabrics and cutting, they use an imprint whereby there's actually zero waste as a result of that. The sneaker is manufactured straight into the sole. So that came about because they had themselves a target to reduce waste, and that resulted in an innovative way of manufacturing. So there is a business driver for it, for sure.
Yeah, but I guess there are lots of different factors driving all of this, not just the black and white picture. But interestingly, from that first poll, Leo, if I can come to you, obviously the headline grabbing figure was that all of the above, 7 in 10 thinking all of them matter and will drive it in the private sector, ESG that is. But the second one was demand from institutional investors and consumers, QNB, Qatar, National Bank, obviously something that you guys know pretty well when it comes to institutional investors. I just wanted to come to you with regards to companies and how they view this. What will it take, do you think, for companies to make better disclosures, especially when there isn't a universally agreed standardized framework that appears at the moment?
Of course. Thank you, Naveed, and thank you to the Al-Attiyah Foundation for inviting me here today. I think that's a great question. It's a question that many corporates struggle with. We as QNB and the sustainability team, we are looking at a number of disclosures, number of different reporting standards. So there's a whole alphabet soup of different type of reporting standards in the marketplace, and different investors, different stakeholders will be interested in different ones. So one of the things that we did when we started was to engage our stakeholders, really understand from them what's important, understand from them what are their priorities, matched it with our own priorities, and then we were able to see from the various reporting standards available which one was best suited. So currently we report predominantly using the Global Reporting Initiative standard. I think it's quite a commonly adopted standard here in the region, in the Middle East. I know some of our neighbors have mandated it for corporates. We've been doing it for the last 5 years. We found that the GRI standard is something that really gave quite a broad view and really helped capture the needs of various stakeholders. But we couple this, of course, with our disclosures to ESG rating companies. So I think many of the attendees today will be aware of that corporates are scored and rated against ESG metrics, and increasingly, even from a credit rating agency perspective, they are acquiring and integrating ESG capability into their own operations. And credit rating agencies are telling corporates, as they've already told sovereigns, at some point in time, the weighting of ESG will impact your credit rating. So on the flip side of reporting against a standard, we also look at disclosure requirements. And I think from there, organizations can do a gap analysis to see, okay, what are the things that we can report on, what are the gaps, and then over time fill them. And this helps you with identifying your priorities and how to take it forward.
Great, thank you. And just to bring in our fourth speaker, thanks, Leo. To bring in our fourth speaker, Howard Bevan from the Al-Attiyah Foundation, you're Director of Energy there. Looking at one thing that jumped out to me at Ali's slides was that first one, perhaps, considering the environment and climate change as a risk to their business. Only 12% of all industry CEOs said yes. Almost 40% of them in the energy industry view it as a major risk. Quite a startling figure, but perhaps understandable given the reliance on the environment. I mean, you've looked at sustainability and ESG for quite some time. You've supported companies in a diverse range of sectors when it comes to sustainability, from finance, banking, fashion, forestry, mining. From what you've done and your experience in the Middle East, decades old now, which aspects of ESG are corporations struggling to address today, do you think, Howard?
Well, yeah, yes, what a good comprehensive question. What I think is happening is that the world is changing very, very rapidly, and people are struggling to keep up. We started certainly in climate change with shortages of investment, but lots of concerns about climate change that perhaps that slowed down investment. And then we came to COVID, and who knows what was happening, but some technology helped, you know. And now we've got a gas shortage. What I would say, certainly from the climate change point of view, just at the moment, nobody really cares. I would say not nobody really cares, but in the very, very short term, nobody cares about climate change, really about ESG at all. It's all about security of supply. And that's a concern, not only concern in Europe, perhaps the only concerns there are not are parts in the US where it's just a cost thing. But everybody else is concerned about security of supply. You're either not getting enough energy or you're worried about next winter, which a lot of people should be. And so you have to go back to, I think, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and to understand that if you're short of energy, if a country is short of energy, it costs lives. So, you know, it's changed very rapidly. And at the moment, nobody is concerned, but everybody is saying ESG is something for the future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point, Howard. I'm just going to throw that back to one of our other speakers, because it's a really important issue. I mean, you and I spoke about this recently, the fact that COP26, all these pledges were made with nations promising this, and then we saw lots of those watered down, put on hold, some of them scrapped because countries were worried about energy security, ramping up coal, etc. Ivano, so when it comes to the realpolitik, things like climate change, ESG put on the back burner, how do you make sure that it goes up to the top of the agenda? Rajesh Doshi has asked this question as well in the Q&A. He says ESG is a non-financial factor. How does it become top priority for CEO and investor?
Well, this is a really good question, simply because CEOs have to define not only the short term, but also the long-term ability of a company to continue to provide profitability to its shareholders. Now, again, there is a very easy debate about where you need to cash out. But at the end of the day, let's have a look at the IPOs that have been rolled out in the region in the last 12 months, for example. All those companies have had an ESG rating. Why did they pursue an ESG rating? Is because they wanted to tap into a larger pool of investors to start with. But why would an investor focus on ESG rating? Essentially, nobody wants to invest. And again, the easiest example is in a coal-fueled business. So any business that is utilizing a heavy fossil fuel intensive energy source is deemed to be facing difficulties in the medium to long term. So any energy company that does not have a a long-term strategy to decarbonize will most likely face the same issues. So if you look at some of the energy companies that have IPO'd recently, you will see switches from more fossil fuel intensive technologies to renewables, fuel switch in certain cases. And this is only on the easy examples. But we have also legislation coming in Europe affecting specific industries like cement, metals, aluminium, fertilizers, energy. Now, an ESG rating is just a more structured framework that will allow you to compare apples to apples. So if you look at the progression, we had CSR, which was community engagement, considered soft and fluffy, very marketing centric. Then you've had sustainability, which is essentially the same as ESG, but it's more about storytelling. It's more about painting your vision in words. And then you have ESG, which is very analytical, very structured into 3 pillars, the same pillars of sustainability, which levy weighted averages to compute a risk, a controversy score, and an ability for a company to move forward. So when you look at these factors, you can easily understand why there is a stringent requirement for standards. The standard is there. Even ESG metrics utilize GRI-backed indicators. The only difference are the weighted averages of the individual KPIs used. Now, in the specific case of how to bring it to the CEO's agenda, well, cost of capital is affected by ESG rating, but not only that, you're actually rated without being known. So it's not like a company needs to pursue its own rating. As an investor, I might engage a firm, like a consulting firm, to actually calculate the ESG rating of a specific company based on their publicly disclosed data. And this is where disclosure becomes important, because in the absence of your own data, someone will have to make up for it.
Yep, good point. And let's talk about disclosure and reporting more generally. Ali, working with companies in the Middle East, I mean, the governments have to play a very, very important role here. We've just heard about the business case, some of these advantages, perhaps, in terms of real advantages to the bottom line may take many, many years to come through long-term impacts. But right here, right now, what are governments doing? What do they need to do? And we've got a question from Dragana Stojkovic as well, who says, the UAE obviously hosting COP28, lots of policy changes coming. What can governments in the GCC do to enforce ESG and make it more mainstream? Because at the moment, it seems that it's a bit synthetic, isn't it, with the whole reporting agenda? And people make a social media video, put it on Instagram or whatever platform to act like they care about ESG. How can governments enforce it, do you think, and make it more mainstream?
Yeah, great. That's a great point, actually, because we can look at it from 2 sides. One is the readiness factor. How ready are organizations to start reporting? Do they have the right data, the right infrastructure beneath to produce reports? And the second one, probably more from the government side, is to what should you be asking the business community to report on? And the good thing on that part is that there are many standards. Probably the bad part is there are too many standards that probably we'll see some convergence in that, and there are signs after COP26 that, you know, with the International Standards Board, that it looks like there is some kind of convergence in terms of what to report, but that'll take time. So I think the best thing governments can do is to at least set a roadmap for the business community and the investor community, saying, you know, in 3 years' time, this is what's expected. In 5 years' time, this is what's expected, because it does take time for for organizations to get ready. And really, it's important to get it right early because it is a big exercise. It's not I decide to write a 20-page report and that's it. There's a lot of consequences to what you say. And you really have to be able to deliver on that. So I think it needs some collaboration between governments and the business community in deciding how to move it forward. There are good examples to look at in Europe and North America in terms of which direction it's gone. And I think interestingly, for those organizations that have an international footprint that are based in the GCC, they probably already started this because it's not an isolation. So what you will find if you're a business that has investments in Europe or activities in Europe, logistics, travel, whatever, you're already taking a lot of these rules into account. If you're raising funding, also there are some advantages to be gained from that. But the government really plays the part, I think, of really setting the direction and spelling it out and saying what is expected of you so that business community.
Great. And Howard, looking at the energy sector, because I know lots of our viewers watching today and joining us are particularly interested in the energy sector as well. One sector perhaps or industry that's seen as particularly impacted by ESG is the energy world, because it's seen to need to clean up its act when it comes to the environment and social governance as well. What would you like to see in order to try and achieve that? Do you think there needs to be more stringent measures, fines perhaps, or subsidies for companies that do well? Or is this something that companies need to be championing on their own, do you think?
Yeah, I have a feeling that the issue is a leadership problem, or not a leadership problem, but a leadership challenge, in that when CEOs fully espouse all the various aspects of ESG, and without speaking for Leo, of course, and QMB, but QMB has been very outspoken in taking a lead on this within certainly Qatar and the Middle East. That when a CEO stands up and says we are doing this and we are doing this, then it permeates through the whole company with attitudes and working committees below, the C-suite type of people. So it sets the tone, but not all the companies are doing this. That's the problem. Certainly in the oil and gas sector, and it's the missing ones that are the problem area, not the companies that take the lead. So, yeah, it's something that has to be grasped at the very top. The other point I would make, perhaps, is that we talk very not selectively, we compound together E, S, and G. And it does seem to me that they are separating a bit, and the energy fossil fuel companies are looking more at the climate change risk and not so much at the S and G, which are going their different ways.
Great. And just before we move on, Leo, I'll let you come back to that point about QMB, which we'll talk about in a bit more. But I'm conscious that we're more than halfway through. Time usually flies by with these when there's so much to cram in. So I want to move on to our second question and our second poll question. So everyone who's listening, please, if you can just try and vote again. Here's the second poll question. Which of the three components of ESG do you expect to grow in dominance from now up to 2050? 2050, obviously a key year for many countries looking to reduce their emissions, but also many companies as well. Which of these three components of ESG do you expect to grow in dominance from now up to 2050? Is it the E, environmental component, the S, the social aspect, or G, the corporate governance component, or D, again, you get the option of saying all three components will continue to receive equal attention. Howard, your point there about the E, the S, and the G bringing us on perfectly to this second poll question. So if you please vote now, and we'll have a look at the results in a second. Great. Wow, a more mixed picture this time around. So hopefully everyone can see this on their screens. The environment component, almost half of people saying that that will be the one that receives most attention by 2050, that grows in dominance. Really, really important. That's particularly for the Middle East and countries like Qatar and others. The social component, less than 20%, so 1 in 5 of you. Governance, very interesting again, 6%. There doesn't seem to be too much expectation around the governance role here. And then all three components will continue to receive equal attention. About 1/3 of you think that. The environmental component, that's quite interesting. Leo, to come on to you as promised then, we're hearing so much about companies need to do this and companies need to do that. From QNB's perspective, I mean, looking at ESG and what you've rolled out so far, have you seen any positive impact from the growing momentum of ESG on your business? If so, what are those positive impacts?
Yes, thank you, David. Yeah, absolutely positive impacts. We can look at it from a kind of financial side, reputational side, and organizational side. I mean, financially, I think many of the other speakers have talked about business case for ESG. Research has also demonstrated, at least in the banking sector and the financial services sector, those companies that focus on ESG have outperformed those that do not. This is fairly consistent, and it has been consistent even during the pandemic times as well. For example, we issued the first sustainable debt instrument, our green bond, the first in Qatar, and remains one of the largest, in fact, the largest conventional green bond from a bank in the region. There have been larger, I think, sukuks and sovereign bonds, but from a conventional perspective, it remains the largest. This has demonstrated to the market that we have a meaningful sustainability plan, or ESG plan, together with our ability to identify risks and opportunities and then to act upon them. And the issuance of such a bond, for example, it was listed on the London Stock Exchange Sustainable Bond Exchange, then it allows us to tap into a pool of international investors. And it allows us to engage in and access the global community in that sense. So that, from a financial perspective, has been positive, and we've been involved in many sustainable related transactions since then. Now, from a reputational perspective, I think there's a huge reputation benefit in terms of engagement with investors, the market, NGOs, your suppliers, but even your own organization as well. So I think the reputation extends also to, as Ivano, Howard, and Ali were saying, your ratings, because the ratings obviously drive your reputational positioning in the marketplace. So that has been positive as well. And we've engaged a lot of our stakeholders on this topic, and I'm engaging with investors, with NGOs on a weekly, if not daily basis. And they're thrilled to talk about ESG and what we're doing in that space. And finally, the final positive I would say is around from an organizational perspective. I think Howard already touched upon it from the tone from the top. But when an organization recognizes that ESG is a very broad topic, and as the fellow speakers have said, it's not just climate, it's not just the E topic, but the spectrum of ESG is very broad, and there are lots of subtopics within there. So looking at everything from cybersecurity, health and safety, gender diversity, inclusion, training your people, engaging with your suppliers, governance, etc. All of those things means that there is not a single division or department in any organization that is not impacted by or cannot impact sustainability or ESG. And an organization recognizing that is actually quite powerful. It starts a journey to embed ESG in the kind of corporate culture, and there it should drive action, and with ESG kind of top of mind through everything it does.
Great, thank you, Leo. Some quite a holistic picture there about the advantages that QNB has seen. Ivano, I'm going to come to you because the first poll results, you said that you were surprised that people didn't give more attention to the positive impacts that it can bring for the company. These sets of results then, half of people saying that the environmental, the E of the ESG is going to run away in the next 20, 30 years. I remember when I first met you at the Dubai Carbon Center of Excellence, I mean, people weren't really talking about these sorts of issues back then. It was probably a decade ago now, something like that. Are you surprised by this finding, given your wider view on the topic, looking backwards in the region in the Middle East? Do you think that's a fair result? Half of people saying the environment is going to be the one that really runs away in the next 20, 30 years?
I have to say that they're representative of my experiences as well. Environment does take the lion's share of the discussion, but what usually corporates fail to see is that social and governance are key enablers as well. So now we've seen a ramp up of environmental requirements as a result of the Paris Agreement coming into force, and a cascading effect from governments to large emitters to their value chains. But the next step will be the social, and the corporate will follow as well. Simply because, as an example, Europe has always been leading on the environmental stewardship, and they're doing exactly the same with social now. So they are requiring specific disclosures, and they will put penalties and fines on companies, whether they are European or working or importing in Europe, if they do not meet the social standards explicitly set forth. But unfortunately, it is how it is. Environment does take most of the discussion, with the S and the G being sharing for second and third place.
Yeah, but as you say, all three of them are fairly equal and perhaps need to develop together alongside each other. Ali, I'll try and elaborate on that point a bit more. Looking at the three ESG pillars, what would you say is the most difficult to measure? I mean, the environmental impact is something you can see in black and white. Can you really measure the social impact that you're having as a company, or the governance side of it? What do you think are the challenges there when it comes to measuring and demonstrating the impact?
Yeah, I agree. Probably the environmental is probably the easier, not the easiest one to measure, and that's because there has been a lot. It's probably had a head start on the others, and it's quite a scientific approach to measuring emissions, etc. I think the social component is probably challenging in terms of measuring your impact. You can measure KPIs on diversity, etc., but whether they're having the intended result, I think that's probably open to interpretations, and maybe a bit more work needs to be done in that space. I think on the result of this survey, I'm not too surprised, because I think that the environmental aspect is 2050 is when a lot of the targets are supposed to be met, and I think that's why I think people will see that as the main issue. I think governance has had a lot of head start, and the topic has been addressed for many years. Social, I think, is new, and I think depending on where you are in the world, it's probably the survey will show a different result.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think perhaps psychologically, the idea of 2050 and reducing emissions, net zero by 2050, perhaps that's having an impact in the way this has these results came out. So we've got about a quarter of an hour as we begin to move on to the last bit of our discussion, and then I also want to take a few more questions from the audience. Thank you, everyone who's writing in. Please do, about a quarter of an hour left, 15 minutes. If you do have any other questions, anyone you want to ask in particular, to Ali, to Howard, to Ivano, or to Leo, please get them in and I'll try and put them across as many as I can. So the last poll question then will go to the third and final poll question, which you can see on your screens now. So which of these statements do you generally agree with the most? A, companies are more likely to succeed and deliver strong returns if they create value for all their stakeholders. That's employees, customers, suppliers, wider society, and not just the company owners. B, companies with corporate visions that are centered on climate resilient growth and societal responsibility are viewed by investors and consumers to have more attractive prospects in terms of long-term ability and resilience to withstand systemic risks. Or C, is it becoming common practice for institutional investors to align their portfolios towards better ESG performance, as they believe that companies that perform well on ESG are better positioned for the long term, better prepared for uncertainty, something we've heard just from Ivano there. Or ESG framework provides a strong basis for companies to achieve long-term value creation. So take a second then, have a read through that, because there's quite a bit there. So do you think companies are more likely to deliver strong returns if they create value for all their stakeholders, not just their owners? Companies with corporate visions centered on climate resilient growth will be more resilient in the future when it comes to systemic risks. Will ESG focus allow companies to be better prepared for uncertainties? Or do you think ESG provides a strong basis to achieve long-term value creation? Which one do you agree with the most? Let's have a look at the results if we can. Interesting. Two front runners there. First of all, companies more likely to succeed, people think, if they create value for all of their stakeholders, not just the company owners. And then the other one that's got about 40% as well, becoming common practice for investors to align their portfolios towards better ESG performance. That companies perform well, are better positioned for the long term, better prepared for uncertainties. Leo, I think you were touching on upon that point when it comes to institutional investors and how that's driving things forward. I just wanted to come to you, Howard, perhaps. You touched upon the issue that companies seem to focus on ESG until it comes to uncertainties. This is an incredibly uncertain time in the world. You have the war in Ukraine, you have the COVID-19 pandemic still with us, energy prices rocketing, inflation, the cost of living crisis in the Middle East, in Europe, in the US. Can we really think about ESG right now? Do we need to be thinking about ESG?
Well, I actually think, it's been touched upon to think about many things. And he has to have, long-term strategy and plans for the medium term and profitability. But, he has to survive tomorrow as well. So, CEOs think about, where the next fuel supply will come from. Yes, if I can become more energy efficient, or I can tweak the technology, if this will help me in the short term, well, I'll do it. So it's all to do with how CEOs act, and they act. The trick to be a good CEO is to act in many different timeframes, I think.
Yeah, and Ivano, just to come to you then, these results, companies more likely to succeed if they create value for all of their stakeholders, not just the company owners. How do you assess that in the Middle East then, particularly where perhaps listed companies take on a different format to other parts of the world? Are you surprised by those findings or not really?
No, actually, I have to say it's really representative, and the companies that have done that have had the best performance on public listing are the ones that actually focus on all the stakeholders, not only the company owners. There is a much better culture. There is a lot more engagement in those companies that you would see elsewhere. And those are the ones that we now see in the newspaper bidding. We see a lot of interest from the public as well. It does absolutely make sense. These are specifically in the GCC area, very diverse and inclusive companies with very strong governance in place. And it's this social and governance component that drives their environmental performance forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Leo, I'm just going to come to you because that top one, it says all their stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, wider society. QNB, one of the largest listed companies in the region, largest listed bank, at least in the region, when it comes to listed stocks. What are the challenges a company like QNB has, do you think, when it comes to implementing ESG and ensuring that you actually do consider your consumers and customers when you have so many thousands, tens of thousands of customers. How do you ensure all the stakeholders have a stake in your ESG moving forward, and what challenges are there around that?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we did before, or at the beginning of our sustainability journey, and I think I mentioned before, is to do a materiality assessment through engaging stakeholders. And it's not a one-off exercise. So we did speak with all our different stakeholders as per the questionnaire and others through either direct interactions, through questionnaires, through engagement, through forums like this, through one-on-one exercises as well. Obviously, the corporate clients, which would constitute kind of fairly large parts of the book, we can have one-to-one sessions with them. With the consumer side, there will be questionnaires and so on. And increasingly, we're doing that, aiming to do that on a more regular basis. And actually, we report upon this in terms of how we engage our stakeholders, the frequency, and the channels to do so. And I think that's key, because that's how you really get the view of what's important to the outside world. And that directly links in many ways to how you're perceived and rated to the outside world. So that's absolutely key. And that assessment of what the stakeholders want, that helped us map our priorities. And we map them against, for example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as Howard mentioned previously, and against kind of other frameworks in the marketplace. And from that, that's what helps us define and drive our initiatives. So our initiatives are based upon what our stakeholders want. And it's important to take that broad view, because in the end, that's who we're serving.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, because obviously the results that you put out, or quarterly results and others, that's going to speak to institutional investors and others. But there is a wider range of communications, perhaps, plays a really important role in ESG, I think. Whether you think of advertising or questionnaires and polls, surveys, the online space, also technology playing a key role. So we've got about 7-8 minutes left. I just want to go to the Q&As now. Thank you everyone who's been sending in your messages, some comments as well. Yasser Al-Jada says the weakness of inclusion in the decision-making process might push parallel organizations to establish their own standards. Tightening liquidity, Yasser says, that could potentially be used as a big stick is not the way to go. As we all see, this could potentially be a building foundation just for that. Interesting. Thanks for that, Yasser, for that comment. We've got a question here. Ali, I think you might be best placed to answer this. It's from Rajesh Doshi, and he says, do we have enough competent ESG professionals to support investors to take the right decisions? That's a really important point. In the Middle East, I mean, KPMG doing quite a lot. Are you struggling to find good talent when it comes to ESG, and what programs are available to make more competent ESG professionals? Looking at the wider infrastructure, is there enough of that in the Middle East?
No. But I mean,
it's an important point.
Sorry?
An important point. It's an important point, because companies want to talk about ESG, but you need people to be able to help them.
Yeah. So really, the first thing to when you look at ESG and professionals in this space, it's not one area. That's very important to think of this as three main areas with a lot of subcategories within it. So I think you might have somebody who's good at who understand governance, but you will not find somebody who will know all three inside out and all the regulations and all the and I think that's the challenge that a lot of organizations have, including ourselves, is when you hire teams, you really need to get the journalist can only take you so far. After that, really, when you get to the nuts and bolts, you have to really get specialists in fields and in industry segments as well. I think the question also talks about what programs are available to create competency. So there are many institutions that are giving diplomas or degrees. There are even university degrees in the subjects. So I think there is this route, and then getting your hands dirty, I guess, on the job and learning that way.
Thank you. Yeah, perhaps the best way to do it. Rajesh, I hope that answered your question, and do let us know. I mean, let's keep this conversation going. Please feel free to to stay connected with the Al-Attiyah Foundation and with Refinitiv as well as KPMG. Let us know your thoughts after this, if there is anything else, and we'll try and include them in the next one that we do. But I'm going to move to another question. Ivano, if we can keep it brief, only a few minutes to go. This is an interesting one from Gaston Bilder. Ivano, you look at climate change and reducing CO2 emissions quite a lot. Here's Gaston's question. If you had to convince the CEO of a Saudi Arabian company, to reduce his company's CO2 emissions, what would you say?
Well, I do that regularly. I do use actually modeling techniques. And again, I'm a development economist, which ties quite well to the previous question as well. Sustainability, ESG, is not about writing a report. There is a lot more to it. And in the case of CEOs, we have a lot of consultants that do exactly this job. So they show the business case over the long term. Keyword here is long term. And you use the economic models. So just show the IRR over a period of 20 years, over the life cycle of the equipment that they use. And the numbers are a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So the business case, both in the long term in particular, but short term as well. We'll come to one final question then. And Ali, this is one directed to you to finish off with then. Gaston again, he says, why do you consider climate change a type 2 risk? It could be part of the risk plan of a company and an opportunity to contribute to being carbon negative.
I think that probably refers to when I was giving my presentation. So yes, so what I meant by it being a type 2 is that it's a risk that will change the way the norm, and we will not revert to how things were. So a bit like how COVID has created the working from home kind of mode of working. So that's never going to go back. You might just revert to a little bit, but it's changed. People have discovered a new way of operating. It's the same goes with climate risk. Say, for example, you change a major part of your supply chain because of that. It's kind of shifts, and that's what I meant by it being a type 2. It's not going to revert to how things were. But I agree with you. You should be considering it all the time, as part of your risk assessments and risk identification process.
Great. Thank you very much, Gaston. I hope that answers your couple of questions. And thank you to all of our speakers for being here, giving up your time and sharing your expertise on the issue. A really, really interesting debate. I find that usually if these things fly by, it's a sign that things have gone well, because there's so much to try and cram in. We did hear a lot, Ivano talking about the business case, the need to be clearly defined, for the ability of a company to be able to adapt to an ever-changing environment. That's something that Howard also said. The world is changing, and from a climate change perspective, in the very short term, no one cares about climate change really, about ESG. It's all about security of supply, which is very, very interesting, looking at the difference across sectors. We also heard from Leo from QMB, who said there's a whole alphabet soup out there when it comes to reporting standards, perhaps a need for a framework to be better defined. And then Ali as well, sharing some of his expertise about how companies are already starting to think about reporting and doing it, taking the rules into account. And Ivano talking about the environment of the ESG. Not so surprised that it's been ahead. I think that's something that all of the panelists agreed, but the other two sectors equally important as well. We had the polls, which gave some interesting results as well. Well, thank you once again for all of your time. We had Ali Al-Shabibi, Partner Governance and Risk and Business Transformation ESG at KPMG Qatar, Howard Bevan, the Director of Energy at the Al-Attiyah Foundation, Ivano Iannelli, the Board Director at the ESG Foundation, and Leo Chi-Wai Tong, Head of Sustainability QNB. And thank you very much for your participation in this. I've been Naweed Jabarkil. Thank you for attending. Just a quick reminder that that guidebook on ESG from the Al-Attiyah Foundation will be released soon. Please do try and get a copy. There's so much in there, great insight and analysis looking at the Middle East in particular and the energy sector. So grab a copy if you can. And thank you for attending this webinar series supported by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with Refinitiv and LSE G Business. Goodbye.